Ah, my dear ones, living alone at this stage of life is like rediscovering an old friend, ourselves. I remember as if it were yesterday when my Frank passed away to heaven. At first, the silence of the house seemed deafening, but gradually I began to hear a voice that had long been muffled. My own. You know, when we're always surrounded by people, it's easy to forget who we really are. We spend so much time being a mother, wife, grandmother, that sometimes we lose ourselves in the midst of it all. But now, alone, I have all the time in the world to reconnect with myself. I remember my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. Poor thing, she became a widow at 65 and thought her life was over. But one day, while tidying up the backyard, she found some old seeds her husband had kept. She decided to plant them, just to see what would happen. And wouldn't you know it, those little seeds transformed her life. Thompson rediscovered her passion for gardening. Slowly, her backyard turned into a real paradise. Roses, daisies, sunflowers. You wouldn't believe the variety of flowers she grows. And the most beautiful thing is to see how her eyes light up when she talks about her plants. It's as if she found a little piece of heaven here on earth. And it's not just Thompson. I myself was surprised to rediscover my love for reading. In the past, I barely had time to flip through a magazine. Now every night I snuggle up in my favorite armchair with a good book. I've read all those classics I always wanted to, you know. And look, I even started writing a diary. Who would have thought that at 70 I'd become a writer? The secret, my dears, is not to be afraid of silence. At first it can be scary, but it's in that silence that we can hear our hearts. It's like cleaning a foggy mirror. Suddenly we see ourselves clearly again. So if you're starting this journey of living alone, don't be scared. Take the opportunity to rediscover yourself. Who knows, you might find talents you didn't even know you had, or rekindle old passions that time had extinguished. Remember, it's never too late to reconnect with yourself. After all, you are the best company you could have. Developing new routines and rituals. My dears, when I started living alone, I confess I felt a little lost. So many years living with an established routine, and suddenly there I was, with all the time, in the world and not knowing what to do with it. But you know what? That's when I discovered the beauty of creating my own routines and rituals. I remember my friend Bob, a retired engineer who lives at the end of the street. After his wife passed away, he would stay up until the wee hours and sleep until almost noon. He was always tired and grumpy, until one day he decided to change. He started waking up early, having a hearty breakfast, and taking a walk in the park. "Mrs. Johnson," he told me one day, "you can't imagine how these mornings have changed my life. Seeing the sun rise, hearing the birds, smelling the dew, it's like I'm rediscovering the world." And it's not just Bob. My friend Lily, a lovely 75-year-old widow, created a nightly ritual that's a true declaration of self-love. Every night she prepares a candlelit bath, puts on soft music, and then snuggles into bed with a good book. "It's my moment," she says with a smile on her face. "At this time, I feel like the queen of the world." I myself created my own routines. Every morning I wake up and make a cup of lemon balm tea that I harvest from my own backyard. I sit on the porch, watch the day dawning, and make a list of 3 things I'm grateful for. In the afternoon, I do crossword puzzles to keep my mind sharp. And at night, I call one of my children or grandchildren for a nice chat before bed. These routines and rituals are like anchors in our day. They give us a sense of purpose, of structure, and the best part is that now we can create them just the way we want. There's no one to say it's right or wrong. It's our life, our way. So, my dears, if you're starting this journey of living alone, try creating your own routines. It can be something simple, like having a hearty breakfast every day, or something more elaborate, like dedicating an hour a day to a new hobby. The important thing is that they are moments that bring joy and meaning to you. Remember, each day is an opportunity to create a life you love. And with the right routines, each day can be a small celebration of life. Becoming more self-sufficient. Ah, my dears, if there's one thing I've learned living alone, it's that we're much more capable than we imagine. You know, when we're always surrounded by people, it's easy to depend on others for everything. But when we find ourselves alone, we discover an inner strength we didn't even know we had. I remember my neighbor Arthur, a 68-year-old gentleman who became a widower a few years ago. Poor thing. At first, he could barely fry an egg. His wife had always taken care of everything in the kitchen, but you know what he did. He bought a basic recipe book and started venturing into cooking. At first, it was a mess. Once, he tried to make a cake and smoke came out the window. We were all worried, thinking the house was on fire, but it was just Arthur learning to use the oven. These days, you should see him. He makes dishes that make your mouth water. The other day, he invited me to dinner and prepared a roast chicken that was divine. His eyes shone with pride when he served. "Me, Mrs. Johnson," he said. "I never thought that at 70 I'd become a chef." And it's not just in the kitchen. My friend Joyce, a lovely 75-year-old lady, started doing small home repairs. She started by changing a light bulb here, tightening a screw there. These days, she fixes almost everything. The other day I found her climbing a ladder to clean the gutter. I almost had a heart attack. But she just laughed and said, "Oh Mary, if I don't do it, who will?" I myself was surprised by my ability to solve problems. I remember the first time the kitchen faucet started leaking. In the past, I would have called my son or a plumber, but that day I decided to try to fix it myself. I watched some videos on the internet. Yes, we old folks know. How to use technology, too. Bought the necessary tools and managed to fix it. It was an incredible feeling of accomplishment. Of course, it doesn't always work out the first time. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we need to ask for help. And that's okay. The important thing is to try. Each small victory is a step towards independence. And it's not just in practical things that we become self-sufficient. We also grow emotionally. We learn to deal with our feelings, to find comfort in ourselves. It's as if we finally understand that happiness doesn't depend on others, but on ourselves. So, my dears, don't be afraid to try new things. You are much more capable than you imagine. Every small challenge overcome is a victory. And remember, there's no shame in asking for help when you need it. The important thing is to keep moving forward, always learning, always growing. All life is a great adventure, isn't it? Rediscovering old hobbies and exploring new interests. My dears, one of the greatest joys of living alone at this stage of life is having time to do what we've always wanted to, but never had the opportunity. It's like opening a chest full of forgotten treasures. I remember my friend Carol, a charming 70-year-old lady. When she was young, she loved to paint, but with marriage, children, and work, the brushes were left behind. After she became a widow, she found an old box in the attic with her painting materials. It was like reuniting with an old friend. These days, Carol's apartment looks like an art gallery. She paints almost every day, and her paintings are beautiful. But the most beautiful thing is to see how happy she is when she's painting. Her eyes sparkle. The smile never leaves her face. She told me once, "Mary, painting isn't just a hobby, it's my therapy. Each brushstroke is like I'm painting my soul. And it's not just Carol. There's Bill, a 72-year-old gentleman who lives at the end of the street. After his wife passed away, he was very sad, hardly left the house. Until one day, he saw a beautiful bird in the backyard and was enchanted. He started researching birds, bought binoculars, and now spends hours observing birds in the park. "Mrs. Johnson," he told me the other day, "I never imagined there were so many different types of birds. Each day is a new discovery. It's as if the world has gained more color. I myself rediscovered my love for gardening. I remember my grandmother had a beautiful garden, and I loved to help her when I was a child. Now I've transformed my backyard into a real paradise. I have flowers of all types, aromatic herbs, even some vegetables. There's nothing better than eating a salad with greens you've grown yourself. But it doesn't have to be just old hobbies. It's a great opportunity to try new things too. My friend Joe, for example, started taking dance classes at 75. At first, everyone thought it was crazy these days. He doesn't miss a dance in town. The secret is not to be afraid to experiment. Who knows, you might discover a talent you didn't even know you had, or find a passion that will give new meaning to your life. And the best part is that now we have time to really dedicate ourselves to these interests. We no longer need to race against the clock, dividing our attention between 1,000 different things. We can dive headfirst into what makes us happy. So, my dears, how about taking a look at that old box in the back of the closet? Or maybe try that activity you've always been curious about, but never had the courage to try. Remember, it's never too late to learn something new or rediscover an old passion. Life is a continuous adventure, and each new interest is like opening a door to a world of possibilities. Building stronger connections with others on your own terms. My dears, one thing I've learned living alone is that the quality of our relationships matters much more than the quantity. When we're always surrounded by people, sometimes we don't give due value to each interaction. But when we live alone, each encounter, each conversation gains special meaning. I remember my friend Doris. After her husband passed away, she was very sad and isolated, but gradually she began to realize that she could relate to people in a different way. She started scheduling individual lunches with each of her children once a month. "You know, Mary," she told me, "before, we would all get together, but there was so much conversation that I could barely really talk to each one. Now in these lunches I can really get to know my children as adults, and it's not just with family." Doris also strengthened her friendships. She has a small group of friends with whom she meets every week to play cards. But the most beautiful thing is to see how they support each other. When one is sick, the others take turns keeping her company. When one is sad, the others are there to offer a friendly shoulder. There's also the case of my neighbor, James. He was a very reserved man, one of those who barely greeted others in the elevator. After he retired and started living alone, he decided he needed to change that. He started organizing weekly game nights at the neighborhood community center. At first, it was just him and 2 or 3 other gentlemen. These days, there's a waiting list to participate. "Mrs. Johnson," he told me, "once I never thought I'd make new friends at 70, but look, now I have a group of people I can count on for anything." I myself noticed how my relationships became deeper. Before, I was always running from one commitment to another, barely had time to really talk to people. Now when I meet a friend for coffee, I can dedicate all my attention to her. It's amazing how rich a conversation can be when we're not in a hurry. And you know what else? I learned to value my own time and space. I no longer feel obligated to accept every invitation or to always be available. When I go out, it's because I really want to, and that makes each encounter more special. Of course, sometimes we miss having someone always around, but learning to be okay alone helps us be better company when we're with others. It's as if we have more to offer, you know? So, my dears, if you're starting this journey of living alone, don't think that means being isolated. On the contrary, it's an opportunity to build deeper and more meaningful relationships. Choose carefully who you want to spend your time with. Dedicate yourself to these people. Be really present when you're with them. And remember, sometimes a single sincere conversation is worth more than 1,000 superficial encounters. Cultivate these special connections. They are life's true treasure. Facing loneliness and finding comfort in solitude. My dears, I'll be honest with you. At first, living alone can be quite a challenge. I remember the first days after my Frank passed away. The silence of the house seemed deafening. I would turn on the television just to have some background noise, you know. But gradually I learned that there's a big difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness, you see, is that bad feeling of emptiness, of lack. Solitude is something completely different. It's being alone but at peace with yourself. It's like a hug you give yourself. I remember my neighbor, Anna, poor thing, when she became a widow, she thought she would never be happy again. She spent her days locked up at home crying, until one day she decided to make a change. She started reserving a little time every afternoon to sit on the porch, have a cup of tea, and simply watch the sunset. At first, she told me she felt a bit silly, but gradually this moment became sacred to her. "Mary," she told me once, "it's amazing how these few minutes alone do me good. It's like I'm recharging my soul's batteries." And it's not just Anna. There's the case of my friend Charlie. He was one of those who couldn't sit still for a second. After he retired, he felt lost until he discovered meditation. Now, every morning he dedicates half an hour to sit in silence and simply breathe. Mrs. Johnson, he told me, I never thought that staying still could be so good. It's like I'm getting to know myself for the first time. I myself discovered the pleasure of being alone. You know that saying that you need to be happy alone to be happy with someone? Well, there's a lot of truth in that. I learned to enjoy my own company. Sometimes I spend an entire afternoon reading a book or tending to my garden or simply looking out the window and letting my thoughts flow. Of course, it's not always easy. There are days when the longing is strong, when we miss having someone to talk to. And that's okay. It's normal to feel this way from time to time. The important thing is not to let these feelings take over. One thing that helps me a lot is maintaining a routine, having things to do, commitments, to keep even if it's just with myself. Another important thing is not to isolate yourself completely. Keeping in touch with friends and family, even if it's just by phone, makes all the difference. And you know what? I learned that loneliness can also be a great teacher. In moments of silence, we have the opportunity to reflect on life, to get to know ourselves better. It's like we're having a long conversation with ourselves. So, my dears, if you're facing loneliness, don't despair. Try to see this time alone as an opportunity for growth, self-knowledge, inner peace. Remember, being alone doesn't mean being lonely. With time, you'll discover that you can be the best company for yourself, creating a space that reflects who you are. My dears, one of the most beautiful things about living alone is being able to create a home that reflects our personality. When we share space with other people, we always need to make concessions, don't we? But now we can make every corner just the way we've always dreamed. I remember my friend Paul. After he divorced at 70, he felt a bit lost in the apartment he shared with his ex-wife. Everything there reminded him of the past. Until one day he decided to make a big change. He donated several old pieces of furniture and started redecorating the place his way. You should see how beautiful it turned out. Paul had always been passionate about jazz, so he hung some posters of his favorite musicians on the wall. He bought a comfortable armchair and placed it next to the window, creating a perfect little corner to listen to his records. He even planted a small herb garden on the balcony. Mrs. Johnson, he told me one day, every time I enter my home now, I feel like I'm entering myself. It's a place that makes me happy. And it's not just Paul. My friend Evelyn, a lovely 75-year-old widow, completely transformed her house after her husband's passing. Before, everything was in neutral tones, very proper. Now, my goodness, it's an explosion of colors. She painted the walls a cheerful yellow, bought floral cushions, hung colorful paintings that she painted herself. You know, Mary, she told me, Carl, her late husband, always liked everything very discreet. I respected that, of course, but now I feel like I can finally express who I am. Each color brings me joy. I myself made some changes at home. I turned the guest room into a sewing studio. I always loved sewing, but never had a space just for it. Now, I have a large table where I can spread out my projects, a cabinet full of colorful fabrics, and an entire wall covered with photos of my grandchildren wearing the little clothes I made for them. It's my little corner of happiness, and it doesn't have to be big changes. Sometimes it's the small details that make all the difference, like putting your favorite photos in beautiful frames, or having that special mug for breakfast, or even changing the arrangement of furniture to create a more pleasant flow in the house. The important thing is to create an environment that makes us feel good, that welcomes us, a place we want to return to at the end of the day, a space that tells our story, that shows who we are. Of course, it can be a bit of work at first. Sometimes we're in doubt, not sure what we want. But don't rush. Keep experimenting, changing little by little. With time, you'll discover what really makes you happy at home, and you know what's coolest? As we create this space, we're rediscovering ourselves too. It's as if, by decorating the house, we're decorating our own life. So, my dears, look around. This little corner is all yours now. What would you like to change? What colors make you smile? What objects tell your story? Don't be afraid to experiment, to dare a little. After all, home sweet home, right? And the sweeter and more welcoming this home is, the happier you'll be in this new phase of life. Practicing mindfulness and gratitude. My dears, One of the greatest blessings of living alone at this stage of life is having time to really pay attention to things. You know that saying about stopping to smell the roses? Well, now we can do that literally. I remember my friend Helen. She was always a very busy woman, running from one place to another after she retired and started living alone. At first she felt a bit lost with so much free time until she discovered mindfulness. "Mary," she told me one day, "you won't believe it, but I learned to brush my teeth in a new way." I confess I found it funny at first, but she explained, now instead of brushing her teeth while thinking about the day's to-do list, she focuses on the sensation of the brush, the taste of the toothpaste, the sound of the water. "It's amazing how such a simple thing can become a moment of peace," she said. And it's not just Helen. There's David, a lovely 78-year-old gentleman who lives at the end of the street. After he became a widower, he started feeling very lonely and sad. Until one day his grandson gave him a little notebook and suggested he write down 3 things he was grateful for every day. At first, David thought it was a bit silly, but he decided to try. He started with simple things: the sun shining, hot coffee, a phone call from a friend. Over time, it became easier to find reasons to be thankful. "Mrs. Johnson," he told me once, "this little notebook changed my life. Now, instead of focusing on what I've lost, I can see all the good things I still have." I myself started practicing a little mindfulness and gratitude. Every morning, when I wake up, before even getting out of bed, I take 3 deep breaths and thank for another day. Then, when I go to make my tea, I pay attention to every detail. The sound of the water boiling, the smell of the herbs, the warmth of the cup in my hands. It's such a nice way to start the day. And you know what's best? The more we practice, the easier it becomes to notice the small joys of everyday life. That bird that made a nest in the backyard tree. The neighbor's smile when greeting us. The especially delicious taste of that fruit. These are things that used to go unnoticed, but now fill our days with small happinesses. Of course, it's not always easy. There are days when we wake up on the wrong side of the bed, when things go wrong, when longing hits hard, and that's okay. The important thing is not to let these difficult moments define our days. Even on bad days, there's always something to be grateful for, even if it's just the simple fact that we're breathing. One thing I learned is that practicing mindfulness and gratitude doesn't mean ignoring problems or pretending everything is always fine. It's more about finding balance, about appreciating what we have even in the midst of difficulties. So, my dears, how about starting to pay more attention to the small details of everyday life? Maybe start a gratitude journal, or simply take a few minutes a day to breathe deeply and connect with the present moment. Remember, happiness isn't just in the big things, but also, and mainly, in the small joys of everyday life. And the more attentive we are to these joys, the richer and fuller our life will be.